This is the age of Jackson Element 3 about the domestic policies of the Jacksonian presidents. And what we're talking about here are presidents that followed Andrew Jackson, and yet were still kind of like him to a degree, something that Andrew Jackson greatly appreciated. He liked the idea of having puppet presidents following him and doing the same things that he did. Now, they weren't as extreme as Andrew Jackson, but they were similar in other ways. Now, this starts, of course, with the election of 1836. At this time, Andrew Jackson has already served 2 terms, so he's voluntarily stepping down. Remember, you didn't have to step down after 2 terms back then, but Jackson does, which is kind of a surprise. I would have thought he would have stuck around a little longer, just given his attitude in general. But in this election, we have 2 guys running, and one of them is Jackson's vice president. Jackson's vice president running in the election is Martin Van Buren, seen here on this slide. And Van Buren is up against William Henry Harrison, a Whig Party candidate. Now, the Whigs were kind of a new party at that time. We'll get back to them a little bit later. But let's go back to Martin Van Buren for just a second here. Now, remember, Andrew Jackson is a Democrat. Martin Van Buren, therefore, is a Democrat. But the Democrats were not wild about Martin Van Buren. They didn't think he was a viable candidate and weren't sure he was going to win the election. Andrew Jackson was the one who made this happen and got Martin Van Buren the nomination. Jackson basically felt like he could be president again using Martin Van Buren as his puppet. Now, if you take a look at this picture, you can see why Andrew Jackson probably didn't want to run for president again himself. Nearing 70 years old, which is, well beyond the average lifespan of someone during that time, Andrew Jackson didn't want all of the responsibilities of the presidency, but he still wanted a say, and that's why he made it happen with his political clout to have Martin Van Buren be the Democratic nominee for president in the election of 1836. Without having all the problems, he had his own little puppet president. Now, Harrison, once again, was from the Whig Party, and the Whig Party was a new political party that was made up of one distinct group of people: anyone that King Andrew had offended. You can see the basic guidelines on this slide right here. Henry Clay was a prominent Whig, as was Daniel Webster, and they recruited a bunch of people who basically disagreed with Andrew Jackson and opposed the presidency for becoming too powerful. Now, these ideals got them a lot of public support, and a lot of people wanted to join the Whig Party. Why did so many people want to join the Whig Party? Well, frankly, it was because King Andrew had made quite a few people mad over the course of his presidency. There was no shortage of people lining up to be in the Whig Party to oppose Andrew Jackson's puppet and the policies that may follow. Nonetheless, in the election of 1836, Martin Van Buren wins barely, 170 to 124 in the Electoral College. And he won because of Andrew Jackson's political support. He had made a lot of people mad, but he still had enough people out there who recognized Martin Van Buren as his yes man and decided to elect Martin Van Buren, hoping they were going to get a little more of Andrew Jackson. Not everybody was keen on this, like I said, but it was enough to get Martin Van Buren elected. Now, Van Buren himself, personality-wise and in terms of physical characteristics, was a short, bald, smart, and accomplished politician. But again, he was resented by his own party. He was far more mild-mannered than Andrew Jackson was, and again, Jackson had carried Van Buren. He wanted Van Buren to be a little more boisterous, but it really wasn't Van Buren's style. I'm not totally convinced that Van Buren was actually ready to be president of the United States. Van Buren had a series of failed domestic policies. The first one was his handling of the Panic of 1837. Now, the reasons for the Panic of 1837 are in a prior lesson. It's mostly about reckless loans from wildcat banks set up by Andrew Jackson. These banks were giving out loans that there was no way possible for people to pay back, but the banks were so greedy they wanted to give out as many loans as possible. Well, again, this causes an economic panic that Van Buren has to deal with, and his response to this was the divorce bill. Now, you're going to want to remember this for AP U.S. history. It comes up a lot on the test. The divorce bill, Van Buren's solution for the Panic of 1837, was to create a treasury that was independent of the government. A completely independent treasury with no government influence. Now, this was a widely unpopular bill that was repealed by the Whigs in 1840, despite the fact that it had originally passed. But if you want to look at it that way, that would end up being the crown jewel of Martin Van Buren's domestic policies. He's going to lose in the election of 1840 to William Henry Harrison, the same guy he ran against in 1836. He loses 234 to 60 in the Electoral College, which shows you basically how unpopular he had become as a president. Van Buren had been a very accomplished politician, as we said before, but it wasn't going to be enough. As he ran again for the Democrats, it became very obvious that the people wanted this guy, William Henry Harrison, of the Whig Party, much, much more. Again, it was a 234 to 60 margin in the Electoral College. Now, part of Harrison's popularity had been the Battle of Tippecanoe back in the War of 1812. He had won the battle and become an instant celebrity back then, and used that effectively in his personal campaign, calling himself the hero of Tippecanoe. But his vice presidential candidate was much less well known. His name was John Tyler, and the campaign slogan, just to bring Tyler's name into it, turned into, as you can see here on the slide, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The campaign slogan basically riding on William Henry Harrison's popularity as a hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. And we'll bring John Tyler along as well. Now, this proved to be one of the most interesting campaigns in American history, and it brings up a term that you're going to want to remember for the AP test as well. It tends to come up a lot, called the hard ciderites. William Henry Harrison was attacked by the Van Buren camp as a poor, old, dumb farmer who lived in a cabin and drank hard cider. Now, hard cider was basically considered to be a poor man's champagne. It was basically fermented cider. The idea being that only poor people and silly people drank hard cider. Well, this basically implied that he wasn't cultured enough to be president. In truth, William Henry Harrison had lived and grown up in a 16-room mansion with 3,000 acres on his property. Nonetheless, the Whigs decided to proudly make log cabins and hard cider campaign symbols. But the Whigs proudly, in effect, attacking Martin Van Buren as an aristocratic dandy. But this was also ironic because while Harrison had grown up basically a wealthy child and was being accused of being a poor, hard ciderite, Martin Van Buren had actually grown up fairly middle class to poor and was now being accused of being an aristocratic dandy. I mean, they had the two candidates totally backwards. But the hard ciderite thing of the 1840 campaign became one of the landmark features in political history. So, in the end, the Whigs got who they wanted, and apparently the country did too, for a short period of time. War hero Harrison took over in March of 1841. And then, after giving the longest inauguration speech in American presidential history, a little over 3 or maybe even 4 hours, I believed, without an overcoat in the cold air of a Washington, D.C. March day, he dies a month after his inauguration from pneumonia. One of the shortest terms, if not the shortest, well, no, it's definitely the shortest term as president in American history. And so all of a sudden, this guy that had basically been, tagging on to the campaign becomes president of the United States, Vice President John Tyler of Virginia. Now, he would be president from 1841 to 1845, and he was an afterthought. I mean, the campaign slogan was Tippecanoe, and Tyler too. They had ridden the back of William Henry Harrison's war efforts in the Battle of Tippecanoe in the War of 1812, and now you had this basic unknown who became president after William Henry Harrison's 1-month presidential term. Now, John Tyler himself is an interesting guy in the history of American presidents, a very polarizing figure. He was a Whig who acted like a Jacksonian Democrat. And because of that, neither party liked him or trusted him. He said he was a Whig, but he didn't act like a Whig. He acted like a Jacksonian Democrat, but he was in the Whig Party. So both parties had a problem with him. As a result, he couldn't really get anything done from 1841 to 45. The Whigs proposed a new Bank of the United States. Tyler vetoed it, even though he was a Whig, but realistically was probably a Jacksonian Democrat. The Whigs proposed a new tariff. Tyler vetoed that as well. The Whigs eventually kicked Tyler out of the party, and they threatened impeachment. But the Jacksonian Democrats didn't want him either because they saw him as a traitor as well. Now, because of this, John Tyler has virtually no chance to win re-election, and he loses in the election of 1844 to James K. Polk. You can see the results down there. It was actually a fairly close race, which was surprising. But not many people knew about James K. Polk. Now, Polk eventually came to be known as Young Hickory. And the reason he was called Young Hickory and the reason he won the election as a virtual unknown is because he was endorsed by his friend and neighbor, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. Now, because of this, people associated the two together. A lot of people thought what they were getting in James K. Polk was a new version of Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory and Young Hickory. Now, Polk as a person was a very intense, hard worker who got things done. The problem was that it drove him to ulcers and sickness. He had chronic problems with diarrhea. And again, ulcers were also a chronic problem because he stayed up way too late on way too many nights, didn't get much sleep. He stressed and fretted about things all the time. He had major stress problems. And in fact, as it relates to this particular lesson, he wasn't known much for his domestic policies, except for the huge expansion of the United States during his term. The concept of manifest destiny, as we continue to address that in this class, comes up during the presidency of James K. Polk. It is during Polk's presidency that he would add Texas as a state, purchase the Oregon Territory, and obtain the Mexican cession. Essentially, Polk was the president when we got the last third of the country. That's a pretty good legacy to leave behind. But other than that, domestically, he really wasn't all that well known. He lowered tariff rates with the Walker Tariff of 1846 and created an independent treasury, but again, that's not what he's known for. He's the president who expanded the country, essentially. Unfortunately for James K. Polk, he wouldn't get a chance to run for president again. His illnesses and his ulcers and all of his various stress-related sicknesses associated with the presidency would kill him, and he would die on June 15th, 1849, a couple of months after leaving office for the next president. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.